Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to be introducing you to our next unit. We're going to be reading the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. If you don't know who Frederick Douglass is, you will by the end of this lesson and after you watch the video that is posted in Google Classroom. So without further ado, this PowerPoint presentation here will also be available for you to look at on Google Classroom. So the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is a slave narrative. This was a narrative that was a personal experience of antebellum, which means pre-Civil War. So antebellum African Americans who had escaped from slavery and found their way to safety in the North. So these narratives that we're talking about, these were written by actual slaves who had escaped from slavery and made their way to freedom and safety in the North. Douglass is probably the most famous slave who accomplished this feat, but there were also other slaves who went through the same or similar hardships and told their tales. This was a big part of the anti-slavery movement in antebellum America. These narratives drew on the Bible for allusions and imagery. They also utilized the rhetoric or the art of persuasion of abolitionism, and you'll also see some traditions of the captivity narrative and spirituality. And oftentimes these things would appeal to the oftentimes white audiences, because we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but the goal of these slave narratives ultimately was to convince and persuade the audience that slavery was wrong and it should be abolished. So again, that's the main purpose of these slave narratives, to arouse the sympathy of readers in order to promote the abolition or the ending of slavery. When you're reading Frederick Douglass, you're going to see how he emphasizes traditional Christian religious ideas. You're also going to see the hypocrisy that many slave owners used when they used religion to justify slavery. And a lot of the parts in this book can be difficult to read. You are going to see firsthand accounts of the cruelty and the violence of slave owners during this period. Again, just some things to be on the lookout for, some repeated motifs, both the physical and emotional abuses of slavery, the white owners' hypocrisy using things like the Bible to justify slavery. This is definitely a quest story, both for Douglass's literacy, his being able to read and write, and his literal quest for freedom from the South to safety in the North. And you're going to see, and we're going to talk a lot about how he uses persuasion to appeal to his audience. And again, this is a pretty vivid picture of a horrifying period of American history from the point of view of a slave. So the reason why I think this is one of, if not the most important book that you will read this year, we've all learned about the history of slavery in our history classes. But just learning about it in a textbook doesn't give you the same experience as seeing this world through Douglass's eyes. So a textbook doesn't allow you to see and feel the fear and the pain and the hate and the discrimination that Douglass's narrative presents. So that's why this is such an important piece that we're going to be reading. There's a couple of terms that I want you to know: nonfiction, autobiography, narrative, abolition, abolitionist, and chattel. Take a minute and read through those. A lot of these terms you're probably already familiar with. There is a short mini biography that you should view. So after you finished this PowerPoint presentation, click on the link to this mini bio of Frederick Douglass. I want to reiterate something that I said earlier. Douglas's purpose in writing his narrative is to persuade his readers that slavery is wrong and it should be abolished. Yes, he is telling his life story. Yes, he is showing you what it was like to be a slave. But ultimately, his goal is to persuade you, to persuade his audience that slavery is wrong and it should ultimately be eliminated. That's his end game. And how does an author persuade an audience? He uses rhetoric. We talked about rhetoric a little bit at the beginning of the school year when we read some sermons during the early colonial period in America. But if you don't remember the rhetorical triangle, here it is again. Ethos, pathos, and logos are the three rhetorical appeals that an author or speaker can use in order to persuade his or her audience. Let's talk about what each of those are. Logos is the appeal to logic, so facts, figures, data, things that you can't really argue with. 9 out of 10 doctors recommend this toothpaste, so why would you use a different one? Pathos is the appeal to emotion. So this is any emotion that you can think of, from positive to negative. Anytime that an author tries to get you to feel something, they're using pathos. We see this most commonly in the commercials for the ASPCA, when you see all the sad images of the dogs and the cats who have been neglected or abused, and you hear the soft music behind them, and it's tugging at your heartstrings, and that's making you want to give a donation to the ASPCA. They are using pathos to persuade you to do that. The last rhetorical appeal you need to know is ethos. Ethos is the appeal to credibility or authority. So the person is worth listening to because they are an expert or they rely on information provided by experts. So for example, like in commercials, when you have a celebrity endorsement of a product, that will be a good example of ethos. I'm going to post a video that you have seen before, but if you need a refresher in the rhetorical triangle, please watch the video on ethos, pathos, and logos that I posted in Classroom. So again, I know I've said this already, but I know I sound like a broken record, but remember that Douglas is trying to persuade his audience that slavery is wrong and that it should be abolished. This is his primary purpose in writing his narrative.